In the last decades of the 17th century, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I began to live in a way that confused his court and terrified his physicians. Deeply religious since youth, he believed that every act of creation left a mark upon the world, and that even human flesh carried the traces of divine design. Over the years that idea grew into conviction. He decided that purity did not come from washing or from distance from the earth, but from remaining close to it. What began as an act of devotion slowly turned into a deliberate rejection of all forms of cleanliness. The order was simple and final. No water was to be brought into his private rooms. No soap, no perfume, no new clothing. The emperor said that water destroyed the dust of creation and that the body should remain as God had formed it. At first his servants obeyed in silence, believing that this was another period of spiritual withdrawal, something that would pass. But weeks turned into months, and the smell that rose from his quarters spread through the entire floor of the palace. Robes stiffened from sweat and grease, and the linen underneath them decayed in place. Physicians noted that his skin had become darker, covered with eruptions and scabs, but when they asked to treat him, the request was denied. The emperor explained that disease was proof of divine labor inside the flesh, and that to interfere with it was to resist creation itself. What followed changed the rhythm of the court. Meals were no longer cleared away. The emperor ordered that food should remain on the table until it decomposed, claiming that decay was simply another form of life. Servants described the growing presence of flies inside the royal chambers. At first they gathered around the leftovers, then around the emperor himself. When one of the attendants tried to drive them off, Leopold forbade it. He said they were messengers of God, drawn to the warmth of living matter. The buzzing, he claimed, was the sound of creation continuing its work. By the middle of the decade, physicians had stopped making official reports. They could no longer examine their ruler, who refused all treatment. In private notes preserved in the Hofburg archives, one of them described how the emperor began to collect the fluids of his body in glass containers. Sweat, saliva, hair, and even blood were sealed and labeled with the date of collection. The emperor called these samples sacred remnants of divine substance and ordered that none be discarded. Shelves appeared in his study lined with jars of pale liquid, each faintly lit by candlelight. Witnesses wrote that he spent long hours observing them, convinced that what moved inside was not decay but proof of God's continuing creation. Court officials avoided his presence, but none dared to speak of it openly. They wrote letters without mentioning the condition of their emperor, pretending that government continued as usual. Those few who were admitted into his rooms described a dim space where the air shimmered with humidity and the slow circling of flies. The emperor's robe clung to his body like a second skin, his hands trembled, and yet he appeared content, as if he had found a form of peace unknown to others. He said that his body was a kingdom, and that within it lived the smallest subjects of the divine. To him, their movement under the skin was not corruption but life itself. By the end of the 17th century, Leopold no longer appeared in public. He ruled through letters signed with an unsteady hand while his courtiers kept distance and silence. In private writings left by the monks who served as record keepers, one sentence repeats again and again: the emperor believed that God still worked through him, not in spirit, but in the living matter of his own decaying flesh. By the middle of the 1670s the emperor's isolation had become absolute. The guards no longer allowed anyone to enter his private wing without direct permission. Courtiers spoke only in whispers, and even the physicians who once served him were replaced by monks from a small order loyal to the throne. Their task was not to heal but to observe. They wrote that the emperor had begun a new practice, one he described as the study of the divine presence inside the human form. Every substance that left his body was preserved in glass, stored on the shelves of his study, and treated as sacred matter. The room itself became known among attendants as the Chamber of Inner Light. The monks' journals describe the arrangement of that chamber. Wooden tables covered with candles, rows of glass jars filled with pale fluid, and the constant sound of dripping moisture from the ceiling. Each container carried a handwritten label with a date, a temperature reading, and a short Latin phrase that translated to "God continues his work." The emperor examined them daily. He believed that within those jars the divine process of creation could be seen directly. When the surface of the liquid began to ripple or darken, he called it the moment of awakening. He said that God had placed life not in the heavens but in the smallest movements of matter. The first reports of living motion inside those jars appear in the notes of the monks. They wrote that particles collected from the emperor's body seemed to swell and twist when exposed to warmth. The emperor interpreted this as proof that creation was still unfolding inside him. He called the moving shapes his angels of flesh. The monks observed quietly and recorded what they saw. No one dared to contradict him. The concept of spontaneous generation was widely accepted at the time, and many scholars still believed that living creatures could arise from decay. What made this different was that Leopold considered his own body the source of that miracle. As months passed, the emperor expanded his experiments. He mixed his sweat with honey, wine, and oil, sealing the mixture inside jars that he kept in darkness. When the liquid thickened or changed color, he wrote that life had taken form. He ordered that the lids should never be opened, because to disturb the process was to kill what God was shaping. Servants were instructed to refill the candles that burned day and night around the shelves. The air in the chamber grew warm and heavy. Witnesses wrote that flies hovered constantly in the corners, feeding on the scent of decay that filled the room. The emperor did not see corruption. He saw only transformation. The smell began to spread through the corridors of the palace. Guards standing near the door complained of headaches and nausea. The emperor's robes darkened with stains from the fluids that soaked through the cloth. His fingers were often covered in a sticky film from the jars he handled. When the monks warned that infection might spread, he dismissed the fear. He said that everything born of his body was part of divine life, and that touching it was a blessing, not a danger. Letters sent from foreign ambassadors mentioned that audiences with the emperor had become rare. Those few who were received described him as weak, trembling, and surrounded by glass. His voice was soft, his speech calm, but the atmosphere around him felt heavy and unnatural. They wrote that the air moved with insects and that the light of the candles reflected on hundreds of sealed vessels lining the walls. None of them dared to ask what was inside. In later records, the monks wrote that the emperor began to identify himself with the act of creation. He believed that by preserving his own decay, he had allowed God to continue the making of the world. The living and the dead, he said, were the same matter in different stages of divine labor. For those who served him, it was no longer possible to tell where religion ended and madness began. They watched as the ruler of an empire turned his body into an altar, convinced that within his flesh a new life was already forming. By the late 1670s, the emperor's private study no longer resembled a room. It had become a system of tables, shelves, and sealed vessels, each one glowing faintly in the candlelight. Courtiers who entered described the air as thick and vibrating, as if the entire chamber breathed on its own. The emperor spent most of his days there, moving slowly between the shelves, touching the jars, and whispering short prayers. He said he could hear movement within the glass, that the work of creation was still unfinished, and that his duty was to guard it. The monks recorded that the collection now filled several rooms. Liquids of different shades stood side by side, yellow, green, and grayish-white, each containing matter taken from the emperor's body. Some held strands of hair, others small clots that floated like tiny organisms. The emperor ordered that none of them be thrown away. When the surface began to change or form bubbles, he called it a sign of divine growth. To him, every shift of color was proof that life itself was expanding. Candles burned at all hours, feeding the air with heat and smoke. The walls glistened with a thin layer of condensation, and the wooden floor stuck to the shoes of anyone who entered. Servants were no longer allowed to clean. The emperor said that even dust and mold were part of the sacred cycle. The monks followed his instructions precisely. They wrote that they could see thin threads moving inside the jars, that small white shapes had begun to appear along the edges of the glass. When asked to explain, the emperor smiled and said they were angels, born from his own flesh, continuing the act of divine creation within him. The growing number of jars changed the rhythm of the palace. Guards rotated every few hours to escape the smell. Those who stayed too long became dizzy. The emperor himself seemed unaware of it. His robes absorbed the scent of the chamber, and wherever he walked, the air behind him carried the same mixture of sweetness and rot. He stopped attending Mass in the chapel, saying that God no longer lived in stone or scripture but in the living matter of his own body. Witnesses describe a strange calm in his speech. He spoke of himself not as a man but as a vessel. He said that decay was not death but a form of communication between worlds. The monks who listened to him wrote that he seemed to experience visions while observing the jars. Sometimes he would lift one to his ear and listen, saying that he could hear the whisper of new life forming. He told them that heaven was not above but beneath the skin, and that humanity's mistake was to fear what God had hidden there. By 1678 the Chamber of Inner Light was recognized by the court as a forbidden area. Only the emperor and his chosen attendants could enter. The rest of the palace was sealed off from it. Servants who carried food to the doorway left it outside without knocking. When they returned, the plates were empty, but no one saw who took them. Inside, the candles never went out. The air shimmered with heat, and the sound of flies filled the corridors even at night. Letters from the Imperial Council mention that official decisions were now written in a new hand. The emperor dictated from inside his chamber, speaking through the door. His orders were still coherent, but the men who delivered them said that his voice had changed, softer, slower, as if coming from far away. Rumors spread that he no longer sat at a desk but reclined among his glass vessels, surrounded by warmth and motion, convinced that he was witnessing the rebirth of the world through his own decay. The monks who remained with him wrote one final note that year. They said that the emperor had begun to use a phrase repeatedly, almost like a prayer: the body gives, the body receives. To them it was a statement of faith. To others it marked the moment when devotion became delusion. Within those glowing jars, the ruler of the empire saw what he believed to be proof of eternal life, a kingdom made not of people, but of the smallest forms of flesh, born and dying within the silent air of his own room. By the beginning of the 1680s, Leopold no longer resembled the man who had once ruled an empire. His body had become a monument to his beliefs. The skin on his hands and neck was discolored and covered in sores that never healed. The smell that surrounded him was heavy and constant, a mixture of sweat, alcohol, and decaying flesh. When the physicians pleaded to treat him, he refused, saying that what they called disease was in truth divine transformation. He told them that God was working through him, reshaping the matter of man into something higher. The monks who remained at his side continued to record every stage of his deterioration. They wrote that his robes were rarely changed, that his skin stuck to the fabric, and that when he moved, small fragments of dried flesh fell from his sleeves. During prayer he would touch his arms and describe what he felt beneath the surface as the movement of new life. At times he whispered that creation had begun again inside him, and that every drop of fluid leaving his body carried the seed of another world. To those who listened, the words were both sacred and horrifying. The chamber around him had become an extension of his body. Hundreds of jars filled with pale liquid stood in long rows, each containing matter that had come from the emperor. Some were cloudy, others thick like melted wax. A few emitted bubbles that rose slowly and burst at the surface. Leopold watched them for hours, convinced that the process was alive. He said that the boundary between flesh and spirit had finally dissolved, that he could see life being born from what others called death. The air inside the rooms grew unbearable. The candles burned low, feeding the smell of oil and decomposition. Flies swarmed in endless motion, landing on his hands, his face, his open wounds. The monks no longer tried to drive them away. They said the emperor called them creatures of continuation. When they landed on his skin, he smiled and said that they were feeding the same cycle that sustained all living things. Witnesses described moments when he sat perfectly still, covered in insects, whispering prayers of gratitude. Reports sent secretly to the council described what could only be called physical collapse. The emperor could no longer walk without help. His legs were swollen, and his feet bled through the cloth of his slippers. He ate little, mostly fruit soaked in wine, and drank mixtures of oil and honey that he said nourished the new creation inside him. The monks wrote that his breath had become shallow and sweet, that his voice trembled, but his mind remained clear. He continued to dictate letters, though none of them concerned politics. They were reflections on divine anatomy, filled with descriptions of shapes and movements he claimed to see within the jars. By that time, the palace had fallen silent. Entire corridors were abandoned. Servants refused to enter the upper floors. The chamber of inner light was no longer just a room but a world of its own, glowing faintly behind closed doors. Every night, the sound of buzzing filled the air above it like a living curtain. The few attendants still loyal to him said that when they brought candles to the door, the air that escaped was warm, humid, and trembling, as if something inside the chamber was breathing. The monks continued to record his final teachings. They wrote that the emperor believed he had reached the border between creation and decay. He said that life was not a gift but a constant transaction, that every death fed another birth. When his fingers began to rot, he said that the body was simply returning its essence to the world. The line between faith and madness was gone. For the monks, he was both a prophet and a corpse still speaking. By the end of the year, he stopped leaving the bed. The vessels that once lined the shelves were moved closer to him, their contents shifting and glistening in the candlelight. He looked upon them as a father looks upon his children. He told his attendants that his task was complete, that he had proven creation never ceased. And when the last light in the chamber flickered, he closed his eyes surrounded by what he believed were the living traces of God's work, born not from heaven, but from the slow, endless transformation of his own flesh. When the emperor finally stopped breathing, no bells were rung. The monks who had stayed by his side were ordered to remain silent until the court decided how to announce the news. The doors of the chamber were sealed, and the guards outside were replaced. For 2 days the palace was quiet. The only sounds came from within the room itself, where candles still burned beside the bed and the air was alive with the hum of flies. When the imperial physicians were finally allowed to enter, they found a scene unlike anything recorded in the medical journals of the time. The air was thick with heat, the sheets soaked with fluid, and the body itself swollen and discolored. The robes had fused to the skin, and when they were removed, parts of the flesh came away with them. The doctors worked in silence. Their notes described what they saw with clinical precision: ulcers filled with larvae, darkened veins, and tissues that seemed to move long after the heart had stopped. One wrote that the emperor's body was not a corpse, but a colony. The autopsy revealed what had been hidden for years. The emperor's organs were infested with parasites. The intestines were packed with worms, the liver was soft and mottled, the lungs contained small nests of insects. The physicians recorded that the internal heat of the body had remained unusually high, as if the decay itself generated energy. One surgeon wrote that the smell was so dense it felt like breathing through cloth soaked in vinegar and blood. The report concluded that the emperor had lived with the infection for years, sustained by his own belief that it was holy. The jars that filled the chamber were examined next. Some were sealed so tightly that they had to be broken open. Inside were clots of flesh, congealed fluids, and fragments of hair and nail. A few contained what the physicians described as moving material. Whether it was larvae or the slow reaction of decomposition was never confirmed. The council ordered that all contents be burned immediately. The monks protested, calling the jars sacred, but the fire was lit that night in the courtyard below the palace windows. Witnesses said the smoke carried a strange sweetness that lingered in the air until morning. After the cremation, the court decided that the emperor's final years would not appear in the official chronicles. The monks were dismissed, their journals confiscated, and the surviving physicians were instructed to destroy their notes. Only fragments of their reports remained, hidden in private archives, where they were rediscovered centuries later. They describe a man who had turned his own body into an experiment, convinced that life could emerge from death if left untouched. Among the few servants who had seen the chamber before it was sealed, there were rumors that something inside the jars had survived the fire. One spoke of faint movement beneath the ashes, another of insects crawling from the embers. None of these accounts were ever proven, but the legend persisted. For years, those who worked in the palace said the upper floors still smelled faintly of oil and decay when the air grew warm. Historians would later call it madness, a symptom of infection and isolation. But for those who read the surviving documents, the conclusion is harder to dismiss. The emperor's beliefs were not the fantasy of a broken mind. They were a reflection of the science and faith of his time, a world that still believed creation could arise from filth, that God's work continued through every form of decay. Leopold I died as he had lived, certain that within his body existed the secret of divine rebirth. The empire he left behind soon erased his final years, preserving only the image of a pious ruler. But in the sealed chambers of the palace, behind the locked doors that no one reopened, the walls still bore the marks of candles, and the stones still held the warmth of the room where a man tried to prove that God never stopped creating life, even in the rotting matter of his own flesh.